Welcome back, dear wanderers. Today we're going to be heading back to Library Wing 1, The Hidden Nest, back to the first Oak's shelf where we'll pick up the first book we see. This one appears to be part of a large journal brought to the library by someone who can no longer be named. Now, without further ado, Saltwater, Chapter 1. Okia pulled the hood of his overtunic closer around his neck. It was always cooler on the water, and the most so just before dawn, when the earth had had the most time to soak up the lingering sun's warmth. He turned back to look upriver again, noting with some satisfaction that no other boats or people could be seen. In about one palm's breadth, they would all be waking up, would all be pulling on aprons, tunics, and skirts, would all be leaving rooms for the morning meal. His sisters would plait one another's hair while it warmed, like they did every morning. His mother would drink warm honeyed tea, wrapping her arms around the cup and sighing obviously. His father would stand behind her, lean over, and kiss her on the cheek. And then someone would say, "Where's Okuyo?" And they would be calling him, and when he did not come, they would be searching the house, finding his hammock empty, running outside, going and striking on neighbors' door jambs, and asking if they had seen him. And everyone would say they hadn't. And then his predictions shivered apart, depending on whether or not they noticed his canoe gone, depending on whether or not they realized the reason he had fled, and the direction. He maneuvered his canoe away from the clay-colored shadow of a bar, churning up a swirl of sediment. There was at least one set of rapids lower down, that he would have to portage around, and then he would come to the Black City, which was as far away as he had ever traveled before. It took a full 7 days there and back. That would give him 7 days more to plan what he would do beyond that. He could stay there, seek labor with a fishing family like everyone who worked for his father. That might be one of the first places they would seek for him, though, once they realized what he had done. For certainly his family would not simply let it be. They would be terribly, terribly shamed if they did not at least make an effort to retrieve him, to drag him back home, and force him to acquiesce. See, if he had had family outside of the City of Steps, he would likely be able to flee to them, but no, all his aunts, uncles, and cousins had been a backbone of the city's trade network since long before anyone could remember. None of them would find better prospects anywhere else, and so they had never left. A dead snag loomed dark in front of him, and he had to dig the ore in savagely to keep himself from running aground on it. One step at a time, he reminded himself, dragging his attention back to canoe and water, cautiously maneuvering around. That was how his father and the workers had taught him to mend nets, untangling the twine before cutting any of it, making all the cuts before tying any of the knots, going slowly and methodically in order. That was how he had learned to plane and carve wood, and had made the ore sitting in his palms, split, then blank, then plain, then polished, never skipping ahead to any step before the previous step was fully completed. Don't skip ahead. He only had to reach the red bar today, and he would be making good time. He could choose what his plan would be once he had reached the Black City, and had slightly more space to think. The rim of Teo slipped over the horizon, sending orange-red bars of light across the water's surface as it shone between the trees. A rush of warmth ran over the side of his face, and he sighed. Maybe this was a good omen. Maybe he would have some luck at least, as certain as the sun's rose. He had not been surprised to find Limazi in his house when he returned to it. That was generally considered an inherent part of having a best friend, that they knew where you lived and could invite themselves over when they wished or if they were seeking you. What had surprised him was that Limazi had not been alone. His father and mother, as well as Okwi's father, mother, and older sister and brother, had all been there in the atrium, and had all turned to look at him as he had pushed aside the screen and walked in. "What?" he had said defensively under the masked stare. His gaze had flickered over to Lamazi, hoping to get some clarification. When they had been much younger, had not even been 10 years of age, they had fairly frequently been dragged before their families together to be criticized for playing pranks or bothering people at their work. But that had not happened for many years now, as both had grown older, and now needed to represent their family's honor. "Okwio." His mother had stepped forward, her eyes shining with pride and anticipation. "We had seen how close you and Lamazi are. You are to be his husband now, for he and his family have asked for you." He would have been significantly less surprised if they had shoved him through the hatch opening and he had fallen down into the river. He had a vague sense that someday he would be married, of course. Barring his untimely death, it would be necessary that he make a marriage, which would help solidify his family's trading bonds among the dominant families of the city. But he had expected it to be much further away. He had expected that he would have been given more of a hand in the choosing. His older sister and her husband had almost browbeaten their parents into arranging them together. So firmly had they discussed their desire for it beforehand. Even his older brother had courted his wife for a few months on their parents' suggestion before they had officially been wed. And if he was being perfectly honest, he had expected that it would have been a woman. Of course, it felt a little bit petty to admit this, even secretly to himself. So you would reject a perfectly nice person just because they're not a woman. You would embarrass your family and yourself and your spouse for that. But Okuyo had considered and realized that he probably would if he had thought he could get away with it. He had had vague thoughts about who he would find amenable for a spouse when he finally did wed, and every single person he had considered had been a woman. He would have liked to be a father someday as well, and if he married Limazi, that would never happen. Likely, he had spent too much time with the workers down on the banks and in the canoes with the water under their soles rather than the sustaining stone. Nearly all of them came from significantly poorer families and could wed whomever they wanted, more or less, without consideration of how it would affect their family's standing in the social structure of the city. So there had been a lot of conversation about their standards for a spouse. One of them had sworn that she would never marry a man who was skilled at cooking. "Because I'm not good at either, and I don't want him showing me up." One of them said he only liked short-haired women, but that was all right because it had been his wife who had requested his hand first, and had been fully willing to cut her braid if he thought it was more beautiful. They had never seemed ashamed of the possibility of rejecting people out of hand for such characteristics, and so Okuyo had thought it was perhaps not terrible if he did not desire to marry a man. He had forgotten that the standards for him were much higher. Lamazi had come forward and taken his shoulders, and the joy on his face had almost been painful. Okuyo had wanted to hide his eyes from its blaze. "Okuyo," he said, "for years I have loved you, and I have wanted nothing more than to be with you forever. I'm so grateful that your family thinks I'm worth it." This was how animals felt, he had thought, when they were caught in a snare. To go forward to agree and let himself be wed to Lamazi would be a lie. He cared about him, of course, only not as a husband. And he had realized in that moment, like a sudden burn, that he would grow to hate him over time. Were everyone to continue under that impression. But to go back and to admit in front of all his family and Lamazi's parents that he did not want this, that he would not take this marriage, would be even worse. It would shatter all their relationships. His father would have no trading partner still willing to deal with him if they knew he had a son so disloyal. His mother and siblings would hate him. And so when Lamazi had leaned forward to kiss him, he had forced himself to remain still, not to pull away, despite the cool and worm-like feeling that had been Lamazi's flesh on his. He had been blushing shyly when he pulled back, as though afraid Okuyo would disappear if he did more, and Okuyo had selfishly wished that were indeed the case. His sister had saved him to an extent, laughing and coming forward and hugging him, ruffling his hair like he was a child again. "Look at you," she had said. "My baby brother has a husband now." And that had broken the tension, stretched like a sinew line throughout the room. And they had all fallen to congratulate him and Lamazi, patting them on the backs and heads, offering jokes about married life. Okuyo's father and Lamazi's mother had started a conversation that they had evidently dropped off just before he had entered, for it began right in the middle of a thought. It was only when his brother asked, "So, who's going to live with who?" that she turned and said, "Oh, but surely you shall come to our house. We would be so glad to have you as a son, and since Lamazi's sister went to the White City with her husband, there is more than enough room." And his parents had offered Lamazi's family food, and the conversation and celebration had gone on. Lamazi had pressed leech-like up against his side, and his skin had crawled with every touch, and his thoughts had closed down to just wishing over and over again that nobody noticed how his smile had stiffened like day-old meat. Poor, poor Okuyo. Perhaps they will be able to find love in the world that they march on towards. For now, though, we'll move on to our next work. This one's an excerpt from a larger textbook. It was brought to the library by Vehemency. Now, without further ado, Insects. Insects. Sermon by Mother Superior Ivana Barisnava. Do you know what you are? Do you know what any of us are? Those with 2 feet and 2 eyes and 2 hands and 2 ears who walk upon our great Mother Earth. We are insects. We were the pilfering insects who crawled over fetid corpses to strip the rot from the bones. We defile ourselves in the eyes of our great Mother Earth. We showed how unworthy we were of her love and compassion. We butchered each other like animals for food. Like the mad blind man in his final day, we stumbled around clawing at one another and turning the ground fallow with our sin. We lusted, producing more insects full of sin, full of rage and madness, who would repeat their father's mistakes. Yet our great Mother Earth, with her endless compassion, gave us her divine child, Elikomet. Elikomet, the great raven and the watchful crow, son and messenger, the divine patron of us insects through the gift of his very flesh. He who was so kind to even take one of us insects as his wife, guided us from the dark and into the love of our mother. How have we repaid his gift to us? How have we repaid our great mother? We've watched our brothers and sisters turn away from Elikomet's words. They've turned their hearts to stone and now violate their holy flesh. They've given in to gluttony and lust and turned their knives away from butchery and back to each other. Gold instead of red runs through their blood. What they have become are not criminals but insects. Insects who crawl over the carcass. When their time comes, they shall be judged, and they shall be flayed and picked over by Elikomet. Their remains cast out, and never shall they know the peaceful land that the Great Mother created. Never will they return to her womb to be reborn. They will only know the endless pain of being exposed and left to bleed forever. But do not think that you are free from the watchful eye of Elikomet. Do not mistake my words for gloating. Each and every one of us have inherited the sin of our forefathers, those insects. Each and every one of us are weak and prone to slipping away unless we hold hands and stay fast against sin and cast out those who turn away from Elikomet and our great Mother Earth, whose doubt and weak faith may spread like a disease and infect the whole hive. No sin must be tolerated, not the lusting for your neighbor's wife, nor the violent love of coins. Bury the adulterer and burn the lover of coins. The child who speaks ill towards his parents must have his tongue sliced. The child who steals a crumb of bread must have her fingers smashed. It is only by Elikomet's love and pity that we do not return to the horrors of creation. We must remember that we are weak as mere individuals, but so long as we guard one another from sin, we may still stand in the love of Elikomet and our mother in this heretical world. Critical thinking questions. Mother Superior Ivana Barisnava, 455 to 610, was the leader of a congregation in the Northern Territories that had established itself after being expelled from Yanipik due to Ivana's fiery preaching and, at the time, suspected involvement in a conspiracy to murder a fellow nun. Ivana's manuscripts for her sermons are the few left from the Anatoly movement, circa 400 to 620. And gave historians and theologians a much better view of what people in the Anatoly movement believed outside of often biased secondhand sources. 1. Compare the insects sermon to the cradled infant sermon on page 442. What sort of differences do you see in tone and style? What are the sermons trying to emphasize? 2. Barisnava stressed humanity's nature as insects. Where do you think she came up with this idea? 3. What rhetorical devices did Barisnava use in her sermon? Tip, go back to page 10 through 30 if you need help. 4. Why do you think Barisnava mentions violent punishment at the end of her sermon? 5. If you could see Barisnava today, what 3 questions would you ask her? And with those critical thinking questions out of the way, thank you very much for coming, dear Wanderers. It has been an honor reading for you. Apologies for the break. I've been out of the country, and I thought I would be able to record more before I left. But now I've got to go and move. So I should be back next week. If not, then I'll just be a little bit late. Good luck out there, and I hope to see you all next time.